In the spring of 1847, a physician named Dr. Augustus Levine documented something impossible in his private ledger, a ledger that would remain sealed in the New Orleans Municipal Archives for 132 years. Over the course of 18 months, he had delivered 47 infants to enslaved women across 7 plantations in St. Charles Parish. Every single child was born with pale skin, light eyes, and features indistinguishable from white children. Every single one vanished within days of birth. When Levine attempted to report his findings to the parish authorities, he was told his services were no longer required. 3 weeks later, his body was discovered in the Mississippi River, his ledger missing. But the births didn't stop. They continued for another decade, spreading across Louisiana like a carefully orchestrated plague, and the children, hundreds of them, simply disappeared into a network so sophisticated that even today, historians can't fully trace where they all went. Before we continue with the story of Dr. Augustus Levine and the children who were never meant to exist, I need you to do something. If you're fascinated by dark historical mysteries that challenge everything we thought we knew about the past, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this. And I'm curious, where are you listening from right now? Drop your state or city in the comments below. Now let's uncover what really happened in those plantation houses along the river, and why an entire system worked so hard to keep it hidden. The truth about those births would eventually surface, but not in the way anyone expected. It would take a fire, a desperate woman's confession, and a ledger that should have stayed lost forever. But before we can understand the network that stole these children, we need to understand the world that created it. A world where human beings were property, where fortunes were built on suffering, and where the color of a child's skin could determine whether they lived as enslaved or free. New Orleans in the 1840s was a city of contradictions, a place where French elegance collided with American ambition, where opera houses stood blocks away from slave markets, and where fortunes were made and lost on the backs of human beings treated as property. The city had become the wealthiest in the South, its prosperity built entirely on cotton, sugar, and the labor of enslaved people who outnumbered free whites in many parishes. The port of New Orleans was the 4th busiest in the world by 1840, with ships arriving daily from Europe, the Caribbean, and the American interior. Cotton bales stacked 20 feet high lined the wharves, waiting to be loaded onto vessels bound for Liverpool and Le Havre. Sugar barrels filled warehouses from the French Quarter to the American sector. And in the markets near the river, human beings stood on auction blocks, sold to the highest bidder while their families watched helplessly. The city's population had exploded in the decades since the Louisiana Purchase. French Creoles, who had dominated the city for generations, now shared space with American businessmen, Irish and German immigrants, free people of color who formed their own distinct community, and the enslaved population that made all of it possible. The languages spoken on the streets were a babel of French, English, Spanish, German, and various African dialects. The architecture reflected this mixture: Spanish colonial buildings with their wrought iron balconies, French townhouses with their hidden courtyards, and newer American structures built in the Greek Revival style that was sweeping the nation. But beneath the surface glamour, New Orleans was a city built on a foundation of violence and exploitation. The Code Noir, originally established under French rule, had been modified but not eliminated under American governance. It regulated every aspect of enslaved people's lives: what they could wear, where they could go, whom they could marry, how they could be punished. The city had a reputation for being more lenient than other southern cities, allowing enslaved people to hire out their own time and sometimes purchase their freedom. But this reputation obscured the brutal reality that most enslaved people faced. St. Charles Parish, just upriver from the city, was home to some of the most profitable sugar plantations in Louisiana. The German coast, as it was known, had been producing sugar since the late 1700s, and by the 1840s, the plantation owners there had refined their operations into ruthlessly efficient machines. The Dufour plantation, the Hadel estate, the Fortier holdings, the Becknell property, the Troxler lands, these weren't just farms. They were small kingdoms, each one operating with its own rules, its own economy, and its own secrets. Sugar cultivation was brutal work, far more dangerous and exhausting than cotton. The cane had to be cut during a narrow harvest window in the fall, then processed immediately before it spoiled. The grinding season, as it was called, ran 24 hours a day for weeks on end. Enslaved workers labored in shifts around massive iron kettles filled with boiling cane juice in buildings where the temperature could reach 120 degrees. Accidents were common. Hands crushed in the grinding machinery, bodies scalded by boiling syrup, workers collapsing from exhaustion and heat. The plantation owners who lived in the grand houses overlooking these operations were some of the wealthiest men in America. They traveled to Europe, sent their children to the finest schools, collected art and rare books, and considered themselves cultured gentlemen. Many of them genuinely believed that slavery was a benevolent institution, that they were caring for people who couldn't care for themselves, that the system was ordained by God and nature. But they also knew, though they rarely acknowledged it openly, that their wealth depended on absolute control over the people they enslaved. Any crack in that control, any suggestion that enslaved people were fully human with the same rights and desires as white people, threatened the entire system. Dr. Augustus Levine had come to New Orleans from Mobile in 1844, a young physician with excellent credentials from medical school in Philadelphia. He was 29 years old, unmarried, and ambitious. He'd hoped to establish a practice among the wealthy Creole families in the French Quarter. But like many young doctors, he found that the established physicians had those families locked down tight. The old medical families, the Mercier, the Labatous, the Soulets, had been treating the Creole elite for generations, and they weren't about to let some newcomer from Alabama take their patients. So Levine did what many struggling doctors did. He took work where he could find it. Plantation medicine was unglamorous but steady. The wealthy planters needed doctors to keep their enslaved workforce healthy enough to labor, and they paid reasonably well for house calls. It wasn't the prestigious practice Levine had dreamed of, but it was a living. He began making regular rounds to 5 plantations in St. Charles Parish, treating everything from fevers to injuries to childbirths. He kept meticulous records, as he'd been taught in medical school. Every patient, every symptom, every treatment went into his ledger. His professors in Philadelphia had emphasized the importance of documentation. Medicine was becoming more scientific, more systematic, and good records were essential for understanding disease patterns and treatment outcomes. It was this habit, this compulsive documentation, that would eventually make him dangerous. Levine was not an abolitionist. He'd grown up in the South, and while he found slavery distasteful, he accepted it as an economic reality. He treated enslaved patients with the same professional care he gave to white patients, but he didn't question the system that made them patients in the first place. He was, in his own mind, simply a doctor doing his job. The enslaved community on these plantations lived in a world of constant surveillance and control. The quarters where they slept were arranged in neat rows, designed for maximum oversight. Each cabin housed multiple families with thin walls that offered no privacy. The overseer's house was positioned to overlook the quarters, and patrols walked through at night to ensure no one was moving about without permission. Their movements were restricted by a pass system. Any enslaved person found off the plantation without a written pass could be whipped or worse. Their relationships were monitored, their children often sold away before they reached adolescence. The women, in particular, lived under a specific kind of terror that the men did not face. The knowledge that their bodies were not their own, that they could be used by white men with absolute impunity, and that any children born from such violence would be enslaved from their first breath. This was not a secret. Everyone knew it happened. The light-skinned children working in the plantation houses, serving at the master's table, were visible evidence of it, but it was never discussed openly. The white families maintained the fiction that these children were simply the result of relationships between enslaved people, even when the children looked exactly like the plantation owner or his sons. But something strange was happening on these plantations, something that even the enslaved women themselves didn't fully understand at first. The children being born weren't just light-skinned. They were white, completely, unmistakably white, and they were disappearing. In March of 1846, Levine was called to the Dufour plantation to attend to a woman named Celeste, who was in labor with her first child. The message had come in the middle of the night, delivered by a young enslaved boy who'd run the 3 miles from the plantation to Levine's boarding house in New Orleans. The boy was breathless and frightened, saying only that Celeste was having a difficult labor and the midwife needed help. Levine gathered his medical bag and rode out to the plantation through the darkness. The road followed the river, passing through groves of live oaks draped with Spanish moss. The air was thick with the smell of the river and the sweet, cloying scent of sugar processing. In the distance, he could see the lights of other plantation houses scattered along the river like lanterns in the darkness. He arrived at the Dufour plantation just before dawn. The main house was dark, but lights burned in the quarters. An elderly enslaved woman named Ruth met him at the door of one of the cabins. She was the plantation's primary midwife, a woman who'd delivered hundreds of children over her 60-some years. Her face was deeply lined, her hands gnarled with arthritis, but her eyes were sharp and assessing. "She's been laboring since yesterday afternoon," Ruth said quietly, leading Levine into the cabin. "Baby's positioned wrong, I can't turn it." Inside, the cabin was stifling despite the cool March night. A fire burned in the small fireplace, heating water in a large pot. Celeste lay on a narrow bed, her face slick with sweat, her body rigid with pain. She was 22 years old, dark-skinned, and had been born on the plantation. This was her first child, and she was terrified. Levine examined her quickly, professionally. Ruth was right. The baby was breech. He'd have to turn it manually, a delicate and dangerous procedure. He'd done it before, but not often, and the risk of losing both mother and child was high. He worked for 2 hours, with Ruth assisting and Celeste biting down on a leather strap to keep from screaming. The overseer, a man named Garrett, came by once to check on the progress, then left again. The plantation owner, Jean-Baptiste Dufour, never appeared. The birth of an enslaved child was beneath his notice. Finally, just after midnight, Levine managed to turn the baby. Celeste pushed through 3 more contractions, and the child was born, a healthy baby girl with strong lungs and good color. But when Levine cleaned the infant and examined her, he felt a cold confusion settle over him. The child was pale, not light brown, not mixed race in appearance, but genuinely pale, with skin the color of cream, and eyes that would clearly be blue once they focused. Her features were delicate, European. The shape of her nose, the set of her eyes, the texture of her hair. Everything about her suggested white ancestry, and recent white ancestry at that. He looked at Celeste, then back at the infant. Celeste's face was unreadable, a mask of exhaustion and something else, fear, perhaps, or resignation. She wouldn't meet his eyes. "The father?" Levine asked quietly, though he already suspected the answer. Celeste didn't respond. Ruth, who was cleaning up the afterbirth, simply shook her head in a way that told Levine not to ask again. He recorded the birth in his ledger, noting the time, the difficulty of the delivery, and the child's condition. Then he added a line that would later seem prophetic. "Female infant delivered to Celeste, property of J. Dufour. Healthy, unusual presentation. Child appears white in complexion and features. Father unknown." He left the cabin as the sun was rising, exhausted and troubled. He'd delivered children to enslaved women before, including children who were clearly of mixed race. But this was different. This child could pass for white in any setting. If he'd seen her in a white woman's arms, he would never have questioned her parentage. 3 days later, when Lavigne returned to check on Celeste's recovery, the child was gone. Celeste was sitting on the porch of her cabin, staring out at nothing. Her breasts were bound tightly, and she moved stiffly as if in pain. "Where's the baby?" Lavigne asked. Celeste didn't answer. She just kept staring. Lavigne found the overseer, Garrett, near the sugar mill. "The infant I delivered to Celeste, where is she?" Garrett barely looked up from the ledger he was reviewing. "Died in the night. Weak constitution, we buried her already." "Died of what?" Lavigne asked, feeling a prickle of unease. "Weak constitution," Garrett repeated flatly. "Happens all the time with these people. They're not as hardy as whites, you know that." But Lavigne had examined that child. She'd been perfectly healthy, with strong lungs and good color. Her reflexes had been normal, her temperature stable. There was no reason she should have died. "I'd like to examine the body," Lavigne said. Garrett finally looked up, his expression hardening. "Body's buried. No point digging it up. You got paid for the delivery, didn't you? That's all you need to worry about." Lavigne wanted to press the issue, but something in Garrett's tone warned him off. He noted the death in his ledger, but he didn't believe it. That night, lying in his rented room in New Orleans, he kept thinking about the child's face, about Celeste's blank expression, about the overseer's too quick dismissal. Something was wrong. He just didn't know what yet. 2 months later, it happened again. This time on the Haydell plantation, a woman named Josephine delivered a boy who looked exactly like the first child. Pale, light-eyed, with fine features that would have fit perfectly in any white family's portrait. Lavigne delivered the child on a humid May evening, with thunderstorms rolling in from the Gulf. The air in the cabin was thick and close, and Josephine screamed through her labor with a kind of desperate fury that unsettled him. Josephine was older than Celeste, perhaps 30, and this was her 4th child. Her other 3 children, all darker-skinned, all clearly of African descent, had been sold away over the years. She'd told Lavigne this matter-of-factly during his examination, as if it were simply a fact of life, which for her it was. When the child was born, Josephine wouldn't look at it. She turned her face to the wall and wept silently while Ruth cleaned the infant. "Josephine," Lavigne said gently, "your son is healthy. Don't you want to hold him?" "Take it away," Josephine whispered. "Just take it away." Ruth wrapped the child and handed him to the overseer who'd been waiting outside. The man took the infant without comment and disappeared into the darkness. Lavigne stood there, his medical bag in hand, feeling like he'd just witnessed something profoundly wrong, but unable to articulate exactly what it was. He'd delivered dozens of children to enslaved women by this point, and he'd seen the full range of emotions: joy, sorrow, fear, love. But this was different. This was rejection born of something deeper than postpartum distress. He recorded the birth in his ledger with the same notation: male infant delivered to Josephine, property of A. Haydell. Healthy. Unusual presentation. Child appears white in complexion and features. Father unknown. When he returned a week later, he was told the child had died. Again, no body to examine. Again, a burial that had already taken place. How did he die? Lavigne asked the overseer, a different man than Garrett, but with the same hard face and dismissive manner. Fever took him quick, the man said. Nothing to be done. But the child had been perfectly healthy when Lavigne left him. No fever, no signs of illness. His temperature had been normal, his breathing clear, his color good. That night, Lavigne sat in his rented room in New Orleans and reviewed his ledger by candlelight. 2 births, 2 healthy infants, 2 deaths within days, both children with the same impossible appearance. He thought about the way Josephine had turned away from her child, the way Celeste had looked at him with that unreadable expression. He thought about the overseers who'd taken the children away so quickly, the convenient deaths, the hasty burials. He thought about the fact that both plantation owners, Dufour and Haydell, were known to visit the quarters at night. Everyone knew it, though no one spoke of it openly. It was one of those unacknowledged realities of plantation life. Something was very wrong. Over the next year, Levine delivered 12 more children with the same characteristics. 12 pale infants born to dark-skinned enslaved women. 12 children who vanished within days, all officially recorded as dead from various causes: fever, weak constitution, failure to thrive, respiratory distress. But Levine had been trained to recognize patterns, and this was a pattern that defied medical explanation. Infant mortality was high among enslaved populations, yes. Poor nutrition, inadequate housing, and limited medical care all contributed to death rates that were 2 or 3 times higher than among white infants. But not like this. Not with this specific profile. Not with children who were born healthy and then died within days. Always without a body available for examination. And never with bodies that disappeared so quickly. Even in the heat of a Louisiana summer, there was usually time for a doctor to examine a deceased infant if he requested it. But these children were always buried before Levine could return. He began asking careful questions. He spoke to Ruth, the elderly woman who assisted with many of the births, but she would only shake her head and tell him to leave it alone. "You don't want to know," she said once when he pressed her. "Trust me, doctor. You don't want to know." "But the children are gone," Ruth interrupted. "That's all you need to understand. They're gone, and asking questions won't bring them back. It'll only bring trouble to you." He tried to speak to the mothers, but they wouldn't meet his eyes. When he asked about their children, they would simply say the child had died, repeating it like a rehearsed line. Their faces were blank, their voices flat. It was as if they'd been trained to give this response. The overseers grew increasingly hostile to his inquiries. One of them, a man named Dupré, who worked on the Fortier plantation, took Levine aside after he'd asked about a child who'd supposedly died. "Listen, doctor," Dupré said, his voice low and threatening. "You're here to deliver babies and treat the sick. That's all. You're not here to ask questions about what happens after. You understand me? I'm just concerned about the high mortality rate." "The mortality rate is none of your concern," Dupré interrupted. "These people have weak constitutions. Their babies die. That's just how it is. Now you can accept that and keep getting paid. Or you can keep asking questions and find yourself without work. Your choice." Levine stopped asking questions openly, but he kept documenting. Every birth, every description, every suspicious death went into his ledger. He began to notice other patterns too. The births always happened at night. The overseers were always present, waiting outside the cabin. The mothers were always alone afterward, no family members allowed to visit, no other enslaved people permitted to see the child. And the children were always taken away by the overseer, never left with the mother even for a few hours. In September of 1847, he delivered his 47th such child, a girl born to a woman named Marie on the Fortier plantation. The child was perhaps the palest yet, with hair that would clearly be blonde once it grew in, and eyes that were already showing hints of green. Marie was different from the other mothers. She was younger, perhaps 19, and she'd been born in Haiti, brought to Louisiana after the revolution there. She spoke French with a Caribbean accent, and she had a fierce intelligence in her eyes that hadn't been beaten down yet. She held her daughter for exactly 3 minutes, whispering something in French that Levine couldn't quite hear. Then she looked directly at him, tears streaming down her face. "Please," Marie said in English, her accent thick, but her words clear. "Please write it down. Write down what you see. Someone needs to know. Someone needs to remember that she existed, that she was mine, that she was real." Levine felt something shift in his chest. "I will," he promised. "I've been writing it all down." Marie nodded, then handed her daughter to the overseer with a look of such profound grief that Levine had to turn away. That was the moment Levine decided he had to act. He couldn't prove what was happening to these children, but he could document it. He could create a record that couldn't be ignored. He could force someone in authority to investigate. He spent 3 days compiling his evidence: 47 births, 47 descriptions, 47 convenient deaths. He noted the dates, the plantations, the names of the overseers present, the names of the mothers. He wrote a careful letter explaining his concerns and requesting an investigation into what he termed irregularities in infant mortality rates among the enslaved population of St. Charles Parish, specifically regarding infants of unusually pale complexion. He was careful not to make accusations. He simply presented the facts as he'd observed them and asked for someone to look into the matter. He thought that if he approached it as a medical concern rather than a moral one, he might get a hearing. On October 3, 1847, he presented his findings to the parish magistrate, a man named Judge Beaumont, who had a reputation for fairness. Beaumont was a Creole gentleman in his 60s, educated in France, and known for his careful adherence to the law. If anyone would take this seriously, Levine thought, it would be him. Beaumont received him in his office in the parish courthouse, a Spanish colonial building with thick walls and high ceilings. The judge sat behind a massive mahogany desk, his face impassive as Levine explained his concerns. Then he handed over the copied pages from his ledger. Beaumont read through them in silence. The only sound was the ticking of a clock on the mantel and the rustle of paper. When he finished, he carefully stacked the pages, aligned their edges, and set them down on his desk. Then he looked at Levine with an expression that wasn't quite anger, but wasn't sympathy either. It was something closer to pity. "Dr. Levine," Beaumont said slowly, "I'm going to give you some advice. Go back to your practice. Deliver the babies you're called to deliver. Keep your records if you must, but do not pursue this matter further." "But the children are property," Beaumont interrupted, his voice hardening. "What happens to them is the business of their owners, not yours, not mine, not the law's. Do you understand?" Levine felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Are you telling me that these infants aren't dying? That they're being taken somewhere?" Beaumont stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. "I'm telling you that there are systems in place that are far larger than you or me, and that interfering with those systems would be very dangerous for you. These plantations generate enormous wealth for this parish, for this state, for the entire South. The men who own them are powerful, and they don't take kindly to interference in their affairs. But if children are being enslaved, children are property," Beaumont repeated, his voice cold now. "They can be sold, traded, given away, or disposed of as their owners see fit. That is the law. If you don't like the law, I suggest you move to Massachusetts. But as long as you practice medicine in Louisiana, you will abide by Louisiana law. Do I make myself clear?" Lavinia stared at him, understanding finally dawning. Beaumont knew. He knew what was happening to the children, and he was part of it. Or at least, he was protecting the people who were doing it. "Perfectly clear," Levine said quietly. He left the courthouse with his copied pages, feeling sick. He'd been naive to think that presenting evidence would result in justice. The system wasn't designed for justice. It was designed to protect property and profit, and enslaved people, including enslaved children, were property. But Levine couldn't forget. That night, he made a second copy of his ledger pages and hid them in his room, sewn into the lining of his mattress. The original he kept with him at all times, in a leather portfolio that he carried everywhere. He also wrote a letter to his sister in Mobile, a sister who had died of yellow fever when Levine was 12, a fact that anyone investigating him would quickly discover. In the letter, he detailed everything he'd learned and everything he suspected. He described the network as he understood it, named the people involved, and explained his fears for his own safety. Then he sealed the letter and hid it in his ledger, between the pages documenting births 32 and 33. 2 weeks later, he received a message that his services were no longer required on any of the St. Charles Parish plantations. No explanation was given. The message was delivered by a clerk from Judge Beaumont's office, and it was clear that this was not a request. Levine's income dropped by more than half. He tried to find other work, but word had spread that he was troublesome, that he asked too many questions. Other plantation owners wouldn't hire him. His practice in the city remained small. 3 weeks after that, on the evening of October 27, 1847, Dr. Augustus Lavigne left his boarding house to meet a colleague for dinner at a restaurant in the French Quarter. He was carrying his leather portfolio, as always. He never arrived at the restaurant. His body was found the next morning, caught in the pilings beneath a dock on the Mississippi River. The official cause of death was listed as accidental drowning, likely the result of intoxication. A bottle of whiskey was found near where his body had entered the water, and witnesses reported seeing a man matching Lavigne's description drinking alone at a tavern earlier that evening. His medical bag was found nearby, its contents scattered. His leather portfolio was gone. The landlady at his boarding house, when questioned by the police, said she'd seen 2 well-dressed men leaving his room the night he died. They'd told her they were colleagues of the doctor, collecting his belongings for his family. She'd thought nothing of it at the time. They'd been polite, well-spoken, and had given her $1 for her trouble. When the police searched Lavigne's room, they found it had been thoroughly cleaned out. His clothes remained, but all his papers were gone. His medical books were still on the shelf, but any loose documents had been removed. The mattress had been slit open, the lining torn out. The hidden copy of his ledger pages was never found. Either the men had been thorough in their search, or the landlady had disposed of it herself after the police left, not understanding what it was. Dr. Augustus Lavigne was buried in St. Louis Cemetery No. 2, in an unmarked grave in the section reserved for paupers and strangers. He had no family in New Orleans to claim his body or his possessions. His few belongings were sold to pay his outstanding rent. Within a month, it was as if he'd never existed. But the births continued. In the years following Lavigne's death, the phenomenon he documented didn't stop. It accelerated. Across Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, enslaved women continued to give birth to children who looked white, and those children continued to disappear. The enslaved community knew what was happening, even if they couldn't speak about it openly. They had their own networks of information, whispered conversations in the quarters after dark. Warnings passed from plantation to plantation by enslaved people who were hired out or sent on errands. The women who'd given birth to these pale children carried a specific kind of grief, a loss that was different from having a child sold away to another plantation. These children weren't just gone. They'd been erased, transformed into something else entirely. And the mothers knew, though they could never say it aloud, that their children were out there somewhere, living as white, never knowing where they came from. Because that's what was actually happening to them. They weren't dying. They were being sold as white children. The system was breathtakingly simple and absolutely monstrous. Plantation owners who fathered children with enslaved women, a common occurrence that everyone acknowledged but no one discussed, faced a problem. These children were legally enslaved, property like their mothers. But if they looked white, if there was no visible trace of African ancestry, they were a visible reminder of the rape and exploitation at the heart of the slave system. They were embarrassing. They complicated the racial hierarchy that the entire Southern economy depended on. A child who looked white but was legally enslaved raised uncomfortable questions. If this child could be enslaved, what did that say about the supposed natural differences between races? If white-appearing children could be born to enslaved mothers, didn't that suggest that the racial categories everyone took for granted were more fluid than anyone wanted to admit? But these children were also valuable. A healthy white child could be sold for 10 times what an enslaved infant would bring. And if the child looked white enough, if there was no visible trace of African ancestry, then who would ever know? So a network developed. Doctors, midwives, lawyers, and traders who specialized in this particular transaction. The children would be taken within days of birth, before the mothers could form attachments, before anyone outside the plantation could see them. False death certificates would be filed, and the infants would be transported to cities, New Orleans, Mobile, Charleston, Richmond, where they'd be placed with white families who wanted children but couldn't have them. or who were willing to look the other way about a child's origins in exchange for a lower price than a legal adoption would cost. The network had existed in some form since the earliest days of slavery in Louisiana, but it had become more organized and sophisticated by the 1840s. There were specific people who handled each stage of the process. First, there were the plantation owners and overseers who identified which children could pass as white. Not every child born to an enslaved woman and a white father would qualify. Many showed clear signs of mixed ancestry. But the children who were pale enough, whose features were European enough, whose hair texture was straight enough, these children were marked for the network. Second, there were the doctors and midwives who facilitated the births and provided the false death certificates. Most of them were like Dr. Levine had been initially. They suspected something was wrong but didn't ask too many questions because they needed the work. A few, however, were active participants who received payment for their cooperation. Third, there were the transporters, men who moved the children from the plantations to the cities. They traveled with forged papers claiming the infants were their own children, or orphans they were taking to relatives, or any number of other cover stories. The children were usually drugged with laudanum to keep them quiet during the journey. Fourth, there were the lawyers who created the false documentation, birth certificates, baptismal records, family Bibles with entries backdated to make everything look legitimate. These men were skilled forgers who understood exactly what documents were needed to make a child's new identity unquestionable. Fifth, there were the brokers who connected the children with families willing to buy them. These men operated out of offices in the cities, presenting themselves as facilitators of private adoptions. They charged enormous fees, sometimes as much as $500 per child, a sum that represented a year's wages for most working people. And finally, there were the families who bought the children. Some of them genuinely believed they were adopting orphans or children whose parents had died. Others knew exactly what they were buying and didn't care. They wanted children, they had the money, and they were willing to look the other way about the circumstances. The entire network was protected by a wall of silence. The plantation owners had every incentive to keep it quiet. They were disposing of evidence of their own crimes. The mothers couldn't speak about it without risking punishment or death. The buyers wanted to believe the children were legitimate, and the children themselves had no memory of their origins. It was, in its way, a perfect crime. The only evidence was in the records, and those records could be destroyed or altered. The only witnesses were enslaved people whose testimony would never be accepted in court, and the only person who'd tried to expose it, Dr. Levine, had been silenced permanently. The system might have continued indefinitely if not for a woman named Henriette Delacroix. Henriette was a free woman of color, a rarity in 1850s Louisiana. Her mother had been enslaved by a wealthy French Creole merchant named Philippe Delacroix, who had freed her in his will and left her a small inheritance. Henriette had been born free, raised in New Orleans, and educated by tutors her mother had hired with the inheritance money. She was 32 years old in 1853, unmarried, and worked as a seamstress making dresses for wealthy white women. She had a small shop in the French Quarter, and she was known for her skill with delicate fabrics and intricate embroidery. She lived in a modest apartment above her shop, maintained a careful, respectable distance from anything controversial, and navigated the complex social world of New Orleans with the caution that all free people of color had to exercise. Free people of color in New Orleans occupied a strange middle ground. They were not enslaved, but they were not equal to whites either. They could own property, run businesses, and even own enslaved people themselves. But they couldn't vote, serve on juries, or testify against white people in court. They had to carry papers proving their free status at all times, and they could be enslaved if those papers were lost or challenged. Henrietta had a younger sister named Margot, who was 27 in 1853. Margot had been born free, just like Henriette, and had worked as a music teacher, giving piano lessons to the daughters of free people of color and occasionally to white families who were willing to overlook her race in exchange for her considerable talent. But in the spring of 1853, Margot's life was destroyed by a legal technicality. A distant relative of Philippe Delacroix, a man named Armand Delacroix who lived in France and had never met Philippe, challenged the manumission papers that had freed Henriette's mother. He claimed that Philippe had not had the legal right to free an enslaved person in his will without the consent of his heirs, and that therefore the manumission was invalid. The case went to court. Henriette hired the best lawyer she could afford, a free man of color named Victor Séjour, who had studied law in France. Séjour argued passionately that the manumission had been legal under the laws in effect at the time, that Philippe had been of sound mind when he wrote his will, and that challenging it 30 years after the fact was unconscionable. But the judge, the same Judge Beaumont who had dismissed Dr. Levigne's concerns 6 years earlier, ruled in favor of Armand Delacroix. He declared that the manumission had been improperly granted, and that therefore Henriette's mother had never been legally free. And if the mother had never been free, then her children, born to an enslaved woman, were also enslaved. Overnight, Margot went from being a free woman with a profession and a future to being property. Henriette, as the older daughter, should have been enslaved too, but Armand Delacroix's lawyer made a calculation. Enslaving one sister would be profitable. Enslaving both would create too much attention, too much sympathy, too much risk of public outcry. So they took Margot and left Henriette free, knowing that the threat of enslavement would keep her quiet. Margot was sold at auction 3 days after the judge's ruling. Henriette stood in the crowd and watched as her sister was put on the block, examined like livestock, and sold to a plantation owner from St. Charles Parish for $800. The buyer was a man named Claude Fortier, owner of one of the largest sugar plantations on the German coast. Henriette fought the ruling through every legal channel available to her, but the law was clear. Enslaved people had no rights that white people were bound to respect, and the technicality was enough to make Margot's enslavement legal. Séjour tried everything: appeals, petitions, even attempting to raise money to purchase Margot's freedom, but Fortier refused to sell. He'd paid good money for her, and he intended to get his value from her labor. In the fall of 1854, Henriette received word through the enslaved community's network that Margot was pregnant. The father, according to the whispers, was Claude Fortier himself. Henriette felt sick with rage and helplessness. Her sister, who had been free, who had been educated, who had had a future, was now being used by the man who'd bought her. In January of 1855, Margot gave birth to a daughter. Henriette, using her status as a free woman and claiming to be bringing supplies for the enslaved community, was able to visit the plantation and see her niece. She bribed the overseer with $10, a significant sum for her, for an hour alone with Margot. The cabin where Margot lived was identical to all the others in the quarters, a single room with a dirt floor, a small fireplace, and a narrow bed. Margot sat on the bed holding her daughter, and when Henriette entered, she began to weep. "Look at her," Margot whispered. "Look at her, Henriette." The child was pale, with features that could pass for white. She had Fortier's nose, his chin, his light eyes. She was beautiful, and she was doomed. "They're going to take her," Margot said. "I heard them talking. Fortier and the overseer. They said she's too pale, that she can't stay here. They're going to take her away and say she died." Henriette held her niece for an hour, memorizing every detail of her face. The tiny fingers, the soft hair, the way she made small sounds in her sleep. She whispered promises she knew she couldn't keep, told the child about her mother's real life, about the music and the freedom that should have been hers. 3 days later, Henriette received word that the child had died of fever, but she knew it was a lie. She knew her niece was alive somewhere, being sold to a white family, being erased from existence, and she decided that she couldn't let it stand. She couldn't save her niece, but she could expose what was happening. She could make people see the truth. So she began to investigate. She used her connections in the free black community, her relationships with enslaved people who worked in white households, her access to white spaces as a seamstress who entered wealthy homes to fit dresses and take measurements. She asked careful questions. She listened to rumors. She pieced together fragments of information that individually meant nothing, but together formed a pattern. It took her 2 years to understand what was happening. 2 years of gathering evidence, of tracking down women who'd lost pale children, of finding the midwives and doctors who facilitated the transfers, of identifying the lawyers who forged documents and the brokers who sold the children. She learned about the network in detail, how it operated, who was involved, how much money changed hands. She discovered that it wasn't just happening in Louisiana. The practice extended across the entire South, anywhere that enslaved women gave birth to children who could pass as white. She found evidence of children being sent to California, to Texas, even to Europe. And in the summer of 1856, she found her niece. The child was living with a wealthy white family in the Garden District, being raised as their daughter. Her name was now Charlotte Beaumont, the same last name as the judge who'd ruled against Margot's freedom and dismissed Dr. Levine's concerns. She was 18 months old, healthy, and had no idea that her mother was enslaved on a plantation upriver, grieving for a child she'd been told was dead. Henriette stood across the street from the Beaumont house and watched Charlotte play in the garden with her nurse. The house was a Greek revival mansion with massive white columns and a garden full of roses and camellias. Charlotte chased a ball across the lawn, laughing, while the nurse followed behind her. She was dressed in a white linen dress with pink ribbons, her hair tied back with a matching bow. Henriette felt something break inside her chest. This child, her niece, her sister's daughter, would grow up in luxury, never knowing where she came from. She would be raised as white, marry white, have white children. The connection to Margot would be severed completely, and Margot would spend the rest of her life enslaved, grieving for a daughter who was alive but might as well be dead. Henriette couldn't reclaim Charlotte. The law wouldn't allow it, wouldn't. Even if she could prove the child's origins, and she had no legal proof, only the word of enslaved people whose testimony wouldn't be accepted in court, it would only result in Charlotte being re-enslaved, not returned to Margot. The system was designed to prevent exactly this kind of revelation, but Henriette could expose it. She could make people see what was happening. She could create a record that couldn't be ignored. She began documenting everything she'd learned. She wrote down names, dates, locations. She tracked down other children who'd been sold into white families. She found 12 in New Orleans alone, and she suspected there were dozens more across the South. She interviewed mothers who'd lost children, recording their stories in careful detail. She spoke to midwives who'd been pressured to provide false death certificates. She found a doctor who'd been part of the network but had grown disgusted with it and was willing to talk, as long as his name wasn't used. She compiled a dossier that was damning in its detail. It named plantation owners, lawyers, brokers, and families who'd bought children. It described the process from beginning to end. It estimated that hundreds of children had been stolen and sold as white over the past 2 decades. In March of 1857, she took her evidence to a newspaper editor named Thomas Whitfield, who ran a small abolitionist paper called The Liberator's Voice that operated on the edge of legality. Whitfield was a white man from Pennsylvania who'd moved to New Orleans in 1855, driven by a genuine commitment to ending slavery. His paper was constantly under threat of being shut down, and he'd been arrested twice for publishing incendiary material. Whitfield read through Henriette's documentation with growing horror. When he finished, he sat back in his chair and stared at her. "If we publish this," he said slowly, "they'll shut us down. They might do worse. They killed that doctor, didn't they? The one you mentioned in your notes?" "Yes," Henriette said. "They killed him, and they'll kill me if they find out what I know. But someone has to tell the truth. These children deserve to have their stories told. Their mothers deserve to be acknowledged." Whitfield was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Give me 2 weeks to verify what I can. I'll send someone to check the parish records, see if the death certificates match your information. Then we'll run it. Front page, the whole story. But they never got the chance. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in New Orleans intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. On March 15, 1857, 6 days before Whitfield's paper was scheduled to publish Henrietta's exposé, a fire broke out in the building that housed his printing press. The fire started at 2 in the morning, when no one should have been in the building, and it burned hot and fast, with an intensity that suggested accelerants had been used. By the time the volunteer fire brigade arrived, the entire structure was engulfed. The building was in the American sector, near the docks, in an area of warehouses and workshops. The fire spread to 2 adjacent buildings before it could be contained, destroying a cooperage and a tobacco warehouse in addition to the printing press. Thomas Whitfield's body was found in the ruins the next morning. He'd apparently returned to the office late at night. Neighbors reported seeing a light in the windows around midnight and been trapped when the fire started. His body was so badly burned that he could only be identified by the watch he'd been wearing, a distinctive silver piece that his wife recognized. The official investigation concluded that a lamp had been knocked over, igniting the paper and chemicals used in the printing process. It was ruled an accidental death, and the case was closed within a week. All of Whitfield's files were destroyed, including everything Henriette had given him. Henriette herself disappeared 3 days after the fire. Her shop was found locked, her apartment empty. Her clothes were still in the wardrobe, her dishes still in the cupboard. But she was gone. The money she kept hidden in a tin under her floorboards, nearly $200, her life savings, was gone too. Some people said she'd fled north, terrified that whoever killed Whitfield would come for her next. Others whispered that she'd met the same fate as Dr. Lavigne, her body dumped in the river where it would never be found. A few suggested that she'd been enslaved, like her sister, and sold away to a distant plantation where no one would recognize her. The truth was more complicated. Henriette had been warned. The morning after the fire, she'd found a note slipped under her door. It was written on expensive paper in an educated hand, and it contained no threats, no explanations. Just 4 words: leave now or die. She'd taken the warning seriously. She'd packed a small bag with clothes, money, and a second copy of her documentation. She'd learned from Dr. Lavigne's mistake and made copies of everything. She'd walked out of New Orleans that same day, leaving everything else behind. She'd made her way north through a network of abolitionists and free black communities, moving from safe house to safe house, never staying anywhere long enough to be traced. She'd traveled by riverboat to Memphis, then overland to Louisville, then by train to Cincinnati. From there, she'd continued north to Cleveland, then east to Philadelphia. By the summer of 1857, Henriette had made it to Philadelphia, where she was using a different name, Henriette Dubois, and trying to build a new life in a city where no one knew her history. She found work as a seamstress again, though she had to start over, building a new clientele from nothing. But she couldn't let go of what she'd learned. She couldn't forget Charlotte, or Margot, or the dozens of other children who'd been stolen and transformed. She couldn't stop thinking about the mothers who were still grieving, still living with the knowledge that their children were alive somewhere but lost to them forever. She tried to interest northern newspapers in the story, but they were focused on bigger battles: the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Dred Scott decision, the growing tensions between North and South that everyone could see were leading toward war. The story of enslaved children being sold as white was too specific, too complicated, too easy to dismiss as unverifiable rumor. "Do you have proof?" editors would ask her. "Do you have documents? Witnesses who will testify?" She had documents, but they were copies of records that had been destroyed. She had witnesses, but they were enslaved people whose testimony wouldn't be accepted in any court. She had her own observations, but she was a black woman, and her word alone wasn't enough. But Henriette kept trying. She refined her documentation, tracked down more cases, built an increasingly comprehensive picture of the network. She learned that it wasn't just Louisiana. The practice extended across the entire South, anywhere that enslaved women gave birth to children who could pass as white. She discovered that some of the children were being sent as far as California, where the gold rush had created a population boom and a desperate need for labor and families. She found cases of children being shipped to Europe, sold to wealthy families who wanted American children but didn't want to deal with the complexities of legal adoption. The network was vast, sophisticated, and protected by people at the highest levels of Southern society. Judges, lawyers, doctors, plantation owners, they all had a stake in keeping it hidden, and they had the power to silence anyone who threatened to expose it. In 1858, Henriette finally found someone willing to help her. A Quaker abolitionist named Rebecca Morris read through Henriette's documentation and immediately understood its significance. Rebecca was a woman in her 50s, a widow who devoted her life to the abolitionist cause. She was part of a network of Quakers who were documenting the horrors of slavery for a book that would eventually be published in London, beyond the reach of Southern legal systems. The book was intended to sway British public opinion against slavery and pressure the British government to support abolition in America. "This isn't just about slavery," Rebecca said, sitting in her parlor in Philadelphia with Henriette's papers spread across the table. "This is about the lie at the heart of the entire system. They claim that race is fixed, that you can look at someone and know their ancestry, that white and black are separate and distinct categories ordained by God and nature. But if enslaved children can be sold as white, if they can grow up and have white children and no one ever knows the difference, then the whole racial hierarchy is a fiction." "Exactly," Henriette said. "That's why they'll kill to keep it secret. Because if people understand that race isn't fixed, that it's something that can be changed or hidden or manipulated, then the entire justification for slavery falls apart." Rebecca was part of a network of abolitionists who were documenting the horrors of slavery for a book that would eventually be published in London. She convinced Henriette to let her include the story in that documentation. They worked together for months, refining the narrative, verifying what details they could, and preparing the manuscript. Rebecca had connections to British publishers who were sympathetic to the abolitionist cause, and she was confident that the book would be published and widely distributed. But even as they worked on the manuscript, the network was adapting. Word had spread about Henriette's investigation, about the near miss with Whitfield's newspaper, about the documentation that had nearly been published. The people running the operation became more careful. They moved the children farther away, destroyed records more thoroughly, and eliminated anyone who asked too many questions. In St. Charles Parish, the births continued, but now the children disappeared even faster. Within hours, instead of days, the mothers were sometimes sold away immediately after giving birth, scattered to plantations across the South, where they couldn't compare stories or organize resistance. The system was tightening, becoming more efficient and more brutal. The network had learned from its near exposure, and it was taking steps to ensure that it would never be threatened again. And then the Civil War began, and everything changed. The war changed everything and nothing. The network of child trafficking continued, even as armies marched across the South, even as plantations burned and enslaved people fled to Union lines. In some ways, the chaos made it easier. Records were destroyed in the fighting, families were displaced, and in the confusion, a pale child could be moved from one place to another with even less scrutiny than before. But the war also created new problems for the network. Union forces occupying Louisiana began investigating reports of irregularities in plantation records. Freedmen's Bureau agents, tasked with reuniting families separated by slavery, started asking questions about children who'd supposedly died, but whose bodies were never properly documented. In 1863, a Union officer named Captain James Hartwell was assigned to investigate reports of missing children in St. Charles Parish. Hartwell was from Massachusetts, a former lawyer who'd joined the army out of genuine abolitionist conviction. He was 35 years old, married, with 2 children of his own back in Boston. He took the assignment seriously because he understood, in a way that many Union officers didn't, that slavery wasn't just about labor. It was about the systematic destruction of families and identities. He began by reviewing parish records, birth certificates, death certificates, property transfers. He spent weeks in the courthouse in Hanville, going through dusty ledgers and boxes of documents. He noticed the same pattern that Dr. Levine had documented 16 years earlier. An unusually high number of infant deaths among enslaved populations, with almost no bodies available for examination and no clear causes of death. The death certificates were suspiciously uniform. Fever was the most common cause listed, followed by weak constitution and failure to thrive. But there were no details, no descriptions of symptoms, no records of treatment attempted. Just a name, a date, and a cause of death. Hartwell cross-referenced the death certificates with plantation records and found more irregularities. In several cases, children who'd supposedly died were still listed in plantation inventories months or even years later, suggesting that the records had been altered or that different children were being recorded under the same names. He interviewed formerly enslaved people who'd fled to Union lines. Many were reluctant to talk, afraid that speaking about the children would somehow endanger them further. But slowly, Hartwell pieced together the story. An elderly woman named Ruth, the same Ruth who'd assisted Dr. Levine, told him everything. She was dying of consumption, coughing blood into a handkerchief as she spoke, and she said she wanted someone to know the truth before she passed. "I helped deliver more than 200 babies in my life," Ruth said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I watched dozens of them disappear. The pale ones, the ones who looked white. They'd be born, and I'd clean them and wrap them, and then the overseer would take them away. The mothers would cry, but there was nothing they could do, nothing any of us could do." "Where did the children go?" Hartwell asked. "I don't know for certain," Ruth said, "but I heard things. The overseers would talk sometimes when they thought we couldn't hear. They'd talk about families in the city who wanted children, about lawyers who could make papers, about how much money each child was worth. Hundreds of dollars sometimes, more than I'd ever seen in my life. Do you remember any names? Any specific people involved?" Ruth named names. Plantation owners, overseers, a doctor who'd replaced Levine after he died, a lawyer in New Orleans who specialized in private adoptions. She provided dates, described the process as she understood it, and told Hartwell about the mothers who were still alive, still grieving for babies they'd been told were dead. "They took hundreds of children," Ruth told Hartwell. "Hundreds. And those children are out there somewhere, living as white, never knowing where they came from. Their mothers are still alive, some of them, still grieving, still wondering if their babies are safe, if they're loved, if they ever think about the women who birthed them." Hartwell was horrified. He immediately began compiling a report for his superiors, documenting what he'd learned and recommending a full investigation. He wanted to track down the children, reunite them with their mothers if possible, and prosecute the people who'd been running the network. But before he could submit the report, he received orders transferring him to Virginia. The transfer was sudden, unexpected, and came with a clear message from his commanding officer: "Drop the investigation. There are bigger battles to fight," Colonel Morrison told him when Hartwell protested. "We're trying to win a war and hold the Union together. We can't afford to open up something this complicated right now." "But the children are gone," Morrison interrupted. "Scattered across the country, living new lives. What do you think happens if you expose this? You'll destroy families, ruin lives, create chaos. And for what? You can't undo what's been done. You can't give those children back their original identities. They're white now, for all practical purposes. Leave it alone. But the people who did this should be prosecuted." "For what?" Morrison asked. "For selling property they legally owned? For forging documents? You think any court is going to convict wealthy white men for crimes committed against enslaved people? Even if we win this war, even if we abolish slavery, you think anyone is going to care about what happened to a few hundred children? Hartwell wanted to argue, but he understood the political calculation. The Union needed the support of moderate Northerners who were willing to fight to preserve the Union, but weren't necessarily committed to racial equality. A scandal involving white families who'd unknowingly adopted enslaved children would be politically explosive. It would raise questions about racial identity, about the legitimacy of families, about the entire social order. It was easier to let it go, easier to pretend it hadn't happened, easier to focus on the war and leave the complicated questions for later. So the investigation was quietly shelved. Hartwell was sent to Virginia, where he served with distinction for another year. He was killed at the Battle of Cold Harbor in June 1864, shot through the chest while leading a charge against Confederate entrenchments. His notes about the missing children were packed up with his personal effects and sent to his family in Boston, where they sat in an attic for decades, unread and forgotten. Ruth died 2 weeks after speaking with Hartwell. She was buried in a mass grave with other formerly enslaved people who died in the contraband camps. Her name recorded in a ledger that would eventually be lost. The war ended. Slavery was abolished. The Freedmen's Bureau worked to reunite families, but they focused on people who'd been sold away, not on children who'd been stolen and transformed. The mothers who'd lost pale children had no legal recourse, no way to prove what had happened, no means of finding their children even if they'd wanted to, and most of them didn't want to. What would be the point? Their children were white now, living white lives. Revealing the truth would only destroy them. It would mark them as black in a society that was, if anything, becoming more rigidly segregated. It would strip them of their social status, their marriages, their futures. So the mothers kept silent. They grieved privately, carried their losses alone, and never spoke about the children who'd been taken from them. The network dissolved gradually as slavery ended and the legal framework that had protected it disappeared. But the children remained, scattered across the country, their origins hidden. Some of them eventually learned the truth. A deathbed confession from an adoptive parent, a discovered letter, a chance encounter with someone who knew the story. But most never knew. They lived and died believing they were white, and their children and grandchildren never had any reason to question it. Margot, Henriette's sister, was freed when the war ended. She stayed on the Fortier plantation as a paid laborer for a few years, having nowhere else to go and no family to return to. Henriette had sent letters trying to find her, but they never connected. The mail system in the South was chaotic in the years after the war, and letters often went astray. In 1870, Margot died of pneumonia. She was 44 years old. She'd never remarried, never had other children, and she'd spent the last 15 years of her life grieving for the daughter who'd been taken from her. She was buried in a small cemetery near the plantation, her grave marked with a simple wooden cross that rotted away within a few years. She never learned that her daughter had lived, that Charlotte had grown up in a wealthy white family just a few miles away in New Orleans, that she'd been raised with every advantage, educated at the finest schools, and introduced to society as the daughter of Judge Beaumont. Charlotte Beaumont, the same Charlotte that Henriette had found in the Garden District 20 years earlier, died in childbirth in New Orleans in 1879. She was 25 years old, married to a wealthy merchant named Edward Clark, and had never known that her mother was an enslaved woman named Margot, who died on a plantation in 1870, still grieving for the daughter she'd held for 3 hours. Charlotte's death was mourned by New Orleans society. She was buried in a prominent tomb in Metairie Cemetery, with a marble angel marking her grave. Her obituary in the Times-Picayune described her as a beloved daughter of one of our city's most distinguished families, taken from us too soon. Charlotte's children, 2 daughters, ages 3 and 5, grew up white, married white, had white children of their own. The secret died with the generation that had created it. Or so everyone thought. Henriette Delacroix lived until 1889, dying in Philadelphia at the age of 68. She'd never stopped documenting cases of stolen children, even though she knew her work would likely never result in justice. She'd never married, never had children of her own, and she'd devoted the last 30 years of her life to creating a record of what had happened. Her papers, discovered after her death by the Quaker community that had supported her, contained records of over 300 cases across 7 southern states. She documented births, disappearances, and the fates of children she'd been able to track down. She'd created a genealogy of stolen identities, a map of families that had been torn apart and reassembled in new configurations. The Quakers preserved her papers, recognizing their historical significance. They were eventually donated to the Library Company of Philadelphia, where they sat in the archives, occasionally consulted by historians, but never widely publicized. The story might have remained buried in those archives if not for a series of events that began in 1979, exactly 132 years after Dr. Augustus Levine's death. Dr. Patricia Jennings was a historian specializing in medical practices in antebellum Louisiana. She was 42 years old, a professor at Tulane University, and she was working on a book about plantation medicine. She'd been conducting research in the New Orleans Municipal Archives for months, looking through boxes of old documents that had been donated by various families over the years. Most of it was routine material: property records, receipts, correspondence, the mundane paperwork of daily life in the 19th century. But in a box labeled Beaumont Family Papers, 1840-1880, she found something extraordinary. A leather-bound ledger, water-damaged and fragile, with pages that were stuck together and partially illegible. Jennings recognized immediately that it was a medical ledger. She could see entries for patients, treatments, and fees. But as she carefully began separating the pages, she realized this was something more significant. It was Dr. Augustus Levine's original ledger, the one that had supposedly disappeared when he died. Jennings spent 3 months carefully separating the pages and transcribing what she could read. The water damage had destroyed some entries completely, but enough remained to tell a story. 47 births, 47 descriptions of pale children born to enslaved women, 47 suspicious deaths. But there was more. Tucked between the pages, she found letters. Letters from Levine to Judge Beaumont, pleading for an investigation. Letters from Beaumont to Levine, warning him to stop asking questions. And one final letter, dated October 26, 1847, the day before Levine's body was found in the river. The letter was addressed to "My dear sister Margaret," though Jennings's research revealed that Levine's only sister had died in childhood. It was clearly a precaution. If the letter was intercepted, it would appear to be personal correspondence, not evidence of a crime. In the letter, Levine described everything he'd learned. He named the plantation owners involved, the overseers who facilitated the transfers, the lawyers who forged documents. He described the network in detail, including the fact that Judge Beaumont himself was one of the primary organizers. "I have documented 47 cases," Levine wrote, "but I believe there are many more. This is not an isolated practice, but a systematic operation involving some of the wealthiest and most powerful men in Louisiana. They are stealing children from their mothers and selling them as white, erasing their identities and their histories for profit." He went on to describe his plan. He was going to take his evidence to a newspaper in New York, beyond the reach of Louisiana law. He was leaving New Orleans the next day, traveling by steamboat to Memphis and then overland to New York. He'd already made arrangements with an editor at the New York Tribune who'd agreed to publish his findings. "If you're reading this," the letter concluded, "it means they've killed me, but at least the truth will survive. These children deserve to have their stories told. Their mothers deserve to be acknowledged, and the men who did this deserve to be exposed, even if they're never punished." Jennings sat in the archives reading room, holding the fragile letter, and felt chills run down her spine. This wasn't just a historical curiosity. This was evidence of a massive crime, a systematic operation that had stolen hundreds of children and erased their identities. She immediately began researching further. She found records of Levine's death, the cursory investigation, the quick burial. She found references to Judge Beaumont's career, his wealth, his prominence in New Orleans society. She found property records showing that Beaumont had owned a house in the Garden District, the same house where Henriette had seen Charlotte playing in the garden. And she found adoption records, or rather, she found the absence of adoption records. In the 1850s, Louisiana had no formal adoption laws. Children were transferred from one family to another through private arrangements with minimal documentation. It was the perfect system for hiding the origins of stolen children. Jennings published her findings in an academic journal in 1981. The article, titled "The Hidden Traffic, Child Theft, and Racial Passing in Antebellum, Louisiana," caused a minor sensation in historical circles. It was picked up by a few newspapers, discussed at academic conferences, and cited in other scholars' work. But it didn't reach a wider audience. The families named in Levine's ledger were long gone. The plantations had been sold and resold, and most people dismissed it as a tragic but isolated incident, a dark chapter in history that was safely in the past. But Jennings kept digging. She traveled to Philadelphia and found Henriette Delacroix's papers in the Library Company archives. She tracked down Captain Hartwell's notes in his family's papers in Boston. She interviewed descendants of enslaved people from St. Charles Parish, some of whom still remembered stories about the pale children who disappeared. And she began trying to find the children, or rather their descendants, there. Using genealogical records, DNA testing, and painstaking historical research, Jennings identified 17 families in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama who were descended from children who'd been sold as white. Some of the families were shocked by the revelation. Others had suspected something but never had proof. A few had known the truth for generations but kept it secret, afraid of the social consequences. One of those families was the Beaumont family. Judge Beaumont's great-great-granddaughter, a woman named Elizabeth Beaumont Clark, agreed to speak with Jennings in 1985. Elizabeth was 62 years old, a retired schoolteacher living in Baton Rouge. She was white-appearing, with pale skin and light brown hair, and she'd grown up believing she was entirely of European descent. But her grandmother had told her a different story. "My grandmother told me when I was 16, Elizabeth said, sitting in her living room with Jennings. "She said that our family had a secret and that I needed to know it before she died. She told me about Charlotte, about how she'd been bought as an infant, about how the judge had arranged the whole thing." "How did you feel when you learned?" Jennings asked. Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at her garden. "I felt like my entire identity was a lie," she finally said. "I'd grown up thinking I knew who I was, where I came from. I'd been taught about my family history, about our French and Spanish ancestors, about our place in New Orleans society, and then I learned that my great-great-grandmother had been enslaved, that she'd been stolen from her mother, that everything I'd been told about my family history was false." "Did it change how you saw yourself?" "Yes and no," Elizabeth said. "I still looked the same. I still had the same memories, the same relationships, but I felt like I was living a lie, like I was passing as something I wasn't, and I didn't know what to do with that knowledge. Who was I supposed to tell? What was I supposed to do with it?" "Did you ever try to find Charlotte's mother's family?" "I tried," Elizabeth said. "But the records were destroyed during the war, and there was no way to trace Margot's descendants. If she had other children, I don't know who they are. I don't know if I have cousins out there who are black, who might be descended from the same woman. It's like that part of my history was just erased." She paused, then added, "And I think about Charlotte sometimes, about what her life was like. Did she ever suspect? Did she ever feel like she didn't quite belong? Or did she live her whole life believing she was white, never questioning it? I'll never know." Jennings's research revealed that this was common. The network had been designed to sever all connections between the children and their origins. Even when descendants learned the truth, they usually couldn't trace their ancestry back far enough to find their enslaved relatives. The documentation had been too thoroughly destroyed, the connections too completely severed. The system had worked exactly as intended. It had taken children who were legally black and transformed them into white people, erasing their histories so completely that even modern genealogical tools couldn't fully reconstruct them. In 1987, Jennings published a book called Stolen Children: The Hidden History of Racial Passing in the Antebellum South. It was extensively researched, carefully documented, and deeply disturbing. It told the story of Dr. Lavinia, Henriette Delacroix, Captain Hartwell, and the hundreds of children who'd been stolen and sold as white. The book was reviewed positively in academic journals and received some attention in the mainstream press. The New York Times ran a feature article about it, and Jennings appeared on several radio programs to discuss her findings. But the story didn't generate the kind of public outrage that Jennings had hoped for. Part of the problem was timing. The book was published in 1987 during the Reagan era, when discussions of race and history were often dismissed as divisive or unnecessary. Many people felt that slavery was in the past, that it was time to move on, that dredging up old injustices only created more problems. Part of the problem was also the nature of the story itself. It was complicated, involving legal technicalities and genealogical research that was hard for general readers to follow, and it raised uncomfortable questions that many people didn't want to confront. If hundreds of children had been stolen and sold as white, how many of their descendants were living today? How many white Americans might have enslaved ancestors without knowing it? What did that mean for racial identity, for family histories, for the entire concept of race itself? These were questions that challenged fundamental assumptions about identity and belonging, and many people simply didn't want to engage with them. But the book did reach some people. Descendants of the stolen children began contacting Jennings, sharing their own family stories and asking for help tracing their ancestry. Some of them had always suspected something was wrong with their family history. Gaps in the records, inconsistencies in the stories, physical features that didn't quite match the supposed ancestry. One of those people was a woman named Sarah Mitchell, who contacted Jennings in 2015, nearly 30 years after the book was published. Sarah had grown up in Atlanta, in a white family, with no reason to question her ancestry. But when she'd done a DNA test out of curiosity, the results had shown a small but unmistakable percentage of African ancestry, about 12%, suggesting that one of her great-great-grandparents had been of African descent. She'd dismissed it at first as an error or a distant ancestor she didn't know about. But then she'd started researching her family history and found gaps in the records. Her great-great-great-grandmother had appeared in New Orleans in 1855 as a young child, with no clear documentation of her birth or parentage. The family story was that she'd been orphaned, but there were no death certificates for her supposed parents, no records of their existence at all. Sarah spent 2 years tracing the records, working with genealogists and historians, and eventually she found her great-great-great-grandmother's name in Dr. Levine's ledger. The child had been born to an enslaved woman named Josephine on the Hadel plantation in May of 1847. She'd been sold to a family in New Orleans when she was 3 days old, given the name Emily Harper, and raised as white. "I don't know how to feel about this," Sarah told a reporter in 2017 after her story was featured in a documentary about racial identity in America. "Part of me feels like I've discovered this important truth about who I am. But another part of me feels like I've lost something. My whole understanding of my family, my identity, my place in the world. It's all different now." "Have you tried to find Josephine's other descendants?" the reporter asked. "I have," Sarah said, "but the records are so fragmentary. I know Josephine had other children before the one who became Emily Harper, but they were all sold away. I don't know where they went or what happened to them. I've connected with a few people who might be distant cousins, but we can't prove it. The documentation just doesn't exist." She paused, then added, "And I can't even find Josephine's descendants, if she had any others." That part of my family is just gone, erased, and I'll never be able to recover it. Sarah's story was featured in a documentary about racial identity in America that aired on PBS in 2018. The documentary explored the legacy of slavery and the ways that racial categories had been constructed and maintained through law and custom. Sarah's story was one of several case studies, and it reached a wider audience than Jennings's book ever had. After the documentary aired, dozens of people contacted the producers, saying they'd found similar gaps in their family histories, similar unexplained DNA results, similar stories of children who'd appeared with no clear origins. Some of them had been researching their ancestry for years, trying to understand the inconsistencies in their family stories. Others had only recently begun to question their identities after taking DNA tests. The documentary estimated that there could be hundreds of thousands of Americans who are descended from children who were stolen and sold as white, most of them with no idea of their true ancestry. The network had been so effective, so thorough in its erasure of records and identities, that the full scope of it may never be known. Dr. Patricia Jennings died in 2003, still working on a follow-up book that would expand her research to other southern states. She'd identified over 200 cases of children who'd been sold as white, and she suspected there were thousands more that had left no paper trail at all. Her research papers were donated to Tulane University, where they remain available to scholars studying the history of slavery and racial identity in America. The collection includes copies of Dr. Levine's ledger, Henriette Delacroix's documentation, Captain Hartwell's notes, and hundreds of pages of Jennings' own research, interviews, genealogical charts, analysis of parish records, and correspondence with descendants of the stolen children. In St. Charles Parish, there's a small museum now dedicated to the history of slavery in Louisiana. It's housed in a restored plantation building, and it tells the story of the people who were enslaved there, the work they did, and the lives they lived. In one corner, there's an exhibit about Dr. Augustus Levine and the children he tried to save. It includes copies of pages from his ledger, photographs of the plantations where the births occurred, and a list of names. The mothers who lost children, the children who were stolen, the families who bought them. The exhibit ends with a question printed on the wall in large letters. How many more stories like this are hidden in our history? How many more children were erased? How many more families were destroyed by a system that treated human beings as property? There's no answer provided. Just the question, hanging in the air, waiting for visitors to grapple with. The museum also includes a memorial wall with the names of the mothers who lost children. The names were compiled from Dr. Levine's ledger, Henriette Delacroix's documentation, and parish records. There are over 300 names on the wall, each one representing a woman who gave birth to a child who was stolen and sold as white. Celeste, Josephine, Marie, Margot, Ruth, and hundreds of others whose names have been lost to history. Visitors to the museum often stand in front of the wall for a long time, reading the names, trying to imagine the lives behind them. Some people cry. Some people take photographs. Some people just stand in silence, bearing witness to a crime that was never prosecuted, a grief that was never acknowledged. The story of the Pale Children of New Orleans is a reminder that history isn't just about the past. It's about the present, about the ways that old crimes continue to shape our world in ways we can't always see. It's about the identities that were stolen, the families that were destroyed, and the truth that was buried so deep that even now we're still digging it up. The network that stole those children was a product of slavery, but its effects rippled forward through generations, creating a hidden web of ancestry that even modern DNA testing can't fully untangle. The children who were sold as white had children who had children who had children, and somewhere in America today, there are people who have no idea that their great-great-great-grandparents were born enslaved in Louisiana plantation cabins. They grew up believing they were white. They married white. They had white children. They lived their entire lives without ever knowing the truth about where they came from. And in most cases, they'll never know. The documentation has been destroyed, the connections severed, the truth buried too deep to recover. But the truth exists, even when we can't see it. The mothers existed, the children existed, the grief existed, and the crime existed, even though no one was ever punished for it. This mystery shows us that the cruelest aspects of slavery weren't always the most visible ones. Sometimes the cruelty was in the erasure, in the systematic destruction of identity and family, in the creation of a lie so complete that it became indistinguishable from truth. The children who were stolen didn't just lose their freedom. They lost their histories, their identities, their connections to the people who loved them. They were transformed into something they weren't, and they never even knew it had happened. And their mothers lived with that knowledge for the rest of their lives. They knew their children were alive somewhere, living as white, never knowing where they came from. They knew they would never see them again, never hold them, never tell them the truth. They carried that grief silently, because speaking about it would only bring punishment. The system that created this horror was designed to be invisible, to operate in the shadows, to leave no trace. And it almost succeeded. If not for Dr. Levine's compulsive documentation, if not for Henriette Delacroix's determination, if not for Captain Hartwell's investigation, if not for Dr. Jennings's research, the story might have been lost completely. But the truth survived. Not intact, not complete, but enough to tell us what happened. Enough to honor the mothers who lost their children. Enough to acknowledge the children who were stolen. Enough to remind us that history is full of crimes that were never punished, injustices that were never corrected, and truths that were buried but never completely destroyed. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? How many more children do you think were stolen and sold as white? How many descendants of those children are living today with no idea of their true ancestry? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video.